What is up, guys? It is another time for an early start to the MLB discussion on the MLB Strategy Show. And I am here, Chris Spags, bright and early on the West Coast with the only man who I'd wake up for at this time. A man who's going to be well equipped to walk us through another pitching slate chock full of interesting options. He's nerd-ass Greg Ehrenberg. How you doing, Greg?
Yeah, better than you slightly. And I know you've really been looking forward to talking about all the pitching options today. So, you know, a lot of them to go through. And it's another interesting slate. It's always funny when I look up at the slate first thing in the morning and be like, oh, I wonder what the ownership projections are. And then the first thing that stands out, it's like, oh, Austin Gomber is chalk. This is going to be interesting.
Yeah, Austin Gomber, Frankie Montas, two of the illustrious names that we are going to go into today as we go game by game. But first of all, hit that like button if you are here watching this video live or after the fact. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel as well. I think we hit 55K yesterday, so that is good news there. But we are now on the march to 60K subscribers, and you can be a part of that as well by subscribing to the channel, hitting the notification bell to see all the content we have going on all day long, from the NBA Strategy Show to the MLB Strategy Show to Live Before Locks, NHL, PGA, MMA along the way. All that's going on the YouTube channel. So subscribe now and hit that notification bell as well so you can see whenever we have content going live. Make sure to check out the free premium tool on the site today of the main slate ownership rankings. That is not the full ownership projections, but it's more of a grade form version of that. So basically the exact same data. It's a little bit easier to read for casual users out there. So go check out those ownership rankings today, free on the site. And if you always want to get access to all the great Awesemo Plus tools and content for nearly every DFS sport out there with an Awesemo Plus weekly pass, you can do that for $29.95 at awesemo.com/join. It includes full access to all the premium content and tools on Awesemo, including player projections, ownership projections, our premium Slack channel, lineup builder, and much more. If you're really looking to play MLB DFS and sign up for our Awesemo Plus MLB weekly package for only $15.95. Either way, the move is on you now. So stop guessing, start winning. Join Awesemo Plus today. Greg, any overarching thoughts on this slate before we get in? I feel like we kind of talked about it. Pitching, not the most impressive. Hitting, maybe not the most impressive either. It does seem like Baltimore going to be projected pretty highly as a top stack. Is anything else you want to bring to people before we go game by game?
Yeah, it's just a lot of chalk that I normally wouldn't expect to see as chalk. So this is a slate where I think it makes a lot of sense, even more so than usual. Like, I'm generally personally playing baseball pretty contrarian anyway, but on this slate in particular, I definitely think, hey, you want to get different? Maybe stack Seattle against a 50% owned Frankie Montas. And I think there's a lot of ways to differentiate yourself from the field.
Yep, and then shout out to some of the guys new in chat. Dwayne Funkhauser, first MLB show this year. Good luck to all. Detroit stack with some stud pitching. Detroit stack, interesting move for your first show at presumably slate of the year, but that's contrarian. Our boy Greg just pitched that, so hey, there you go. You got that going for you. And shout out to all the new people here checking out the MLB shows. We do these again pretty much every day of the week. A couple versions of as well. MLB Deeper Dive coming up at 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. East Coast time. So join us there for another take closer to when the slate locks. Let's get into the game by game here. First game up, we got Colorado getting 3 implied runs. And another joy of recent slates is that sometimes we just don't know who's pitching when we start the day. That is the case today for the Mets, where the Mets are going to have a mystery partner tagging in today at starting pitcher. And Greg, we have this happen a lot recently, but maybe you know who the Mets starting pitcher is, and I just haven't seen it yet in our usual data sources. But anything for you on the Mets starting pitching, anonymous pitcher right now in the mix?
No, and let's see if in the last 5 minutes since we've started, if there's been any sort of starting pitcher that's been named. But yeah, this always throws a little bit of a wrench in the plans, especially when we've got, an hour to kill and there's only 6 games to talk about. And it's, well, one of the teams we don't have a starting pitcher for. But yeah, still no starting pitcher for the Mets. Nothing's changed in the last 5 minutes. So at least as of now, Austin Gomber is the best starting pitcher known in this game.
I guess the one thing that jumps out is that the implied total is out. Like, Colorado having 3 implied runs is pretty low. So I guess it has to be somebody pretty good pitching for the Mets. So, I mean, their bullpen's been decent as well. Colorado's been bad enough where you could credibly, I guess, give them a 3 implied total in some other situations. But I would think here that Colorado as a stack not going to be the most appealing, regardless of who's out there, because it's a low total for, Mets like trotting out a pitcher that we don't know. And normally when the pitcher is somebody that we don't know, it is usually a crappy guy. And I feel like the low total maybe indicates this is not that crappy of a guy.
Yeah, I know that right now Draftkings has it listed as David Peterson, who's relatively crappy, but I don't know. We don't have an official starting pitcher for the Mets. Does the run total seem high or low? I don't know. I guess it depends who actually ends up starting. I don't really have too much else to add because I agree. It is a really low total, but I mean, I think at this point we just look at how bad the Rockies are, and I figure they're just gonna have a low implied run total on the road against whoever they're going up against as a pitcher. So To me, it's hard to think this is going to be a great spot to stack Colorado, but I mean, we'll see what the ownership ends up being.
Yeah, and I would say whoever the pitcher is, obviously we'll know more by the time, or hopefully we'll know more by the time the deeper dive rolls around, coming up in about 4 hours or so. But I would say that to me, I would have some interest in whoever the Mets pitcher is tentatively. The fact that they are a money line favorite and getting 3 implied runs against them. If it is David Peterson, I have had some interest in him in the past, so I wouldn't mind going there. But one that I think some interesting signs here for whoever is going to be pitching for the Mets that we'll hopefully know for the next few hours. But let's jump to the other pitcher here, Austin Gomber, who, as Greg mentioned, going to be fairly chalky today on the DraftKings slate, over 20% ownership expected for Austin Gomber. And to Gomber's credit, he has been better this year, up to a 24% K rate since 2019, or actually since last season, rather. It's at a 23.5% K rate, and a home run rate for him under league average of 2.6% this year, but actually been under 2% going back to last season. So Gomber's been relatively not bad, at least in terms of giving up production. 1.3 whip is mediocre, as are his 10% swing strike rate and 27% chase rate. But on this slate, Greg, I guess I could see how Gomber would be this owned in a relatively cold day at Citi Field, 62 degrees expected. I think, to me, Gomber a perfectly fine play for the same reason the Mets pitcher would be, whoever it is. There's a low total here and not a great Mets lineup either.
Yeah, so one thing that's really confusing about this spot to me is I see somebody like Austin Gomber as chalk, and my first feeling is, oh, okay, I want to stack against him for leverage. But then you go to the top stacks and you look at the ownership on the Mets, and the Mets are really popular too. So that's really confusing. We have the Mets right now projected for 8.5% ownership as a team with only 4.8% chance of being the top stack on the slate. So it's a really weird situation where it looks like both Gomber and the Mets are potentially going a little bit overowned, but if I had to pick one side of it right now, it actually would be Gomber, just because the pitching options are so terrible for the slate. And I mean, you look overall, like 20% owned for Gomber is pretty significant. Although maybe that number comes down once we get a confirmed starting pitcher for the Mets. But I mean, beyond that, it's like we've got chalk, Frankie Montas picking up nearly 50% ownership. So you are getting Gomber for a cheaper price than Montas, and it's not like he's been significantly worse or anything than Montas. Actually, Gomber's probably been a little bit better this year, and he is still generating, some strikeouts this year. Is a 24% strikeout rate. So as much as I made fun of the slate at the top for having Austin Gomber as a chalk pitcher, I think relative to the other options in the ownership, I actually don't think he's a terrible play.
Gomber's only given up a 115 whip since the last couple seasons, so that's a pretty decent mark as well. Not giving up a lot of power, cold weather day, park that generally is not the toughest for pitching either. And I think there's a lot of signs going to Gomber where normally Austin Gomber, not a name that we're going to advocate for too much, but 5 innings per start so far this year, 5 innings per appearance so far this year. Decent projection as well. He's a guy who's going to come up in an optimizer, and as long as that ownership, I guess, stays where it is there a number, Greg, that Gomber can get to where you're going to go more inclined to go against him, even with the Mets, I guess, looking like a pretty decently owned stack?
Just based on what the current ownership is for the stacks, it looks like I'm going to be pretty severely underweight to the Mets. I mean, we have the Mets right now as, the 6th most popular stack, but they actually have the 2nd worst overall odds of being the top stack on the slate. So right now, I don't really think there's a number that Austin Gomber would get to that would make me go really heavy on the Mets. That is unless more ownership for Gomber would mean less ownership for the Mets. But I mean, as it looks right now, they just look really overowned.
The Mets hitter is going to see a lot of ownership going to guys like Francisco Lindor in particular, but also Cameron Maybin picking up a good amount of ownership, cheap price tag, and he should be hitting in the 3-hole. At least is currently doing that in the projected lineup here. This is a weaker lineup, though, where the best hitter, I guess you could say, is Dominic Smith right now. Maybe, Lindor has been certainly better historically, though, just on his recent run, and I guess going against left-hand pitching has not been that good overall. Just a 160 ISO since 2019, 260 batting average. Those are okay numbers. But, Greg, if you were going to sack the Mets, it does seem like there's going to be a lot of ownership going to those two with Lindor and Maybin. Good amount going to VR as well as Dominic Smith. And I guess Tomas Nido also going to be not that far behind, under 10% ownership for him, but still 5-man stack going to be owned for those top 5. And it is an ugly top 5. So does anybody stand out as being actually worth being with the field on?
This is a really bad Mets lineup right now. As you just really look through the projected lineup, when you have, Pete Alonso, he was just placed on the injured list. Jeff McNeil, he's hurt. Kevin Pillar, hurt. Michael Conforto, he's hurt right now. So you just look at the list of the names that are actually in the Mets lineup, and it's brutal. We have the top of the projected order being VR, Lindor, and Lindor, as much as I expect him to get much better going forward, he's had a really poor start to the season. You mentioned Dominic Smith so far has been the best hitter in the lineup this year. And then you got Cameron Maybin hitting 3rd, James McCann, he's been terrible this year. He's hitting 5th. it's a really bad Mets lineup. And that's one of the other reasons I'm surprised it's picking up that much ownership. So we'll see how the day goes on, how it adjusts. But, on paper, this really looks like a solid matchup for Gomber.
Janeshi Fargas has been hitting decently well down the order, which is something he has a silly name. We've said it. We didn't know who he was initially, but hitting with a 250 ISO so far, only 21 at bats, but is showing some signs of pop that I wouldn't hate getting to a little bit of 2,200 if you are really dead set on playing this Mets stack. But as Greg is saying here, it's not the prettiest lineup, going to be owned like it is a good lineup. So for the most part, I do think the Mets, unless this ownership changes meaningfully around, going to be tough to be left holding the bag with this Mets team, and Gomber might be the more appealing option. Let's keep going here. We got Cleveland getting 4 implied runs. Going to get Spencer Turnbull, recent no-hitter thrower. Spencer Turnbull on the year. Turnbull now down to a 0.96 whip. 3.9 xFIP, though, does show that he's probably not much better than he's been historically. Has his 4.5 xFIP going back to 2019. The strikeout rate from Greg also under league average of 22% K rate. The main thing he's been doing is not giving up a lot of home runs. Down to under a 1% home run rate since 2019. Also a 1.6% home run rate. And I guess that's a decent reason to like him on some slates where he's cheap. But now, I think because of that no-hitter, because of some of the numbers on the year, he is almost 8K on DraftKings, going to be substantially higher priced than Austin Gomber. And Awesemo does have Gomber having about 4 fantasy point higher projection, I guess closer to 3 fantasy point higher projection than Spencer Turnbull. So I don't know that I see the reason to go to Turnbull today very much at all. The field's not going there either, Greg. So how are you feeling about Turnbull as a money line favorite, but guy who's also going to be 2.5% owned for pretty good reason?
Yeah, so here's something I'm pretty concerned about with him is I'm looking at his pitch count numbers right now, and he had not thrown over 100 pitches the entire season. The Tigers have been playing it pretty cautious with his workload, and then because he had the no-hitter last game, he threw 117 pitches. So you kind of start to wonder, is there any carryover effect from that? Like I said, hadn't thrown over 100 pitches all year. Started the season just 62 pitches in his first outing, and they've slowly been building him up. But generally he's been in like the 80 to 90 range, and then all of a sudden goes all the way up to 117. And, if he struggles early in this spot, I would assume that's probably a little bit of a carryover effect from working really deep into the game last time out. So it does look like there is a lot of ownership on the Indians and not ownership on Turnbull right now. But even so, I don't mind getting to Cleveland right now. We have them project for a 10.7% chance of being a top stack on the slate. And then I have concerns about the fatigue right now of Turnbull.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable to have concerns about, his. I think really I have more concern about him just being able to beat any sort of projection here at his price tag. Like he's so substantially under a 2x value projection for that median number. And maybe he can throw another no-hitter. I find that to be not the most likely thing that will ever happen again in his career. And I don't think that's the hottest take either. But I do think Turnbull, to me, not useful as a pitching option. I do think, though, with some of the stuff he's showing this year, only a 6% barrel ball rate. The launch angle is very low. The fly ball rate's down to 30%. I do feel like Turnbull's going to make it tougher for Cleveland. And that to me is the main thing I'm seeing here, where you have really lofty ownership going to guys like Cesar Hernandez, Eddie Rosario, Jose Ramirez up top. All these guys projected to be in the neighborhood of 25% owned on DraftKings, according to our ownership projections at Awesemo.com. And I feel like, to me, as a result, I don't like this Cleveland stack. I don't think Turnbull's any great shakes. I doubt he's going to suddenly be an ace strikeout guy. Again, I doubt he's ever going to throw another no-hitter, but I do think he's showing an ability to sort of limit production meaningfully. And it's not the best thing. I guess the weather heating up a little bit in Detroit, going to be just shy of 80 degrees today, but still, this is a lot of ownership for a Cleveland team that I think just might have a tougher time against Turnbull than people may think.
Yeah, so there are a couple of individual hitters, though, that I think make sense. Like Austin Hedges, we're projecting for less than 1% ownership at catcher right now. And he's somebody who's always been a catcher who, not necessarily the best hitter, but we've seen him with a little bit of pop in the past. It's always difficult to get production out of a catcher anyway, but under 1% ownership for him, I think that's reasonable. Ahmed Rosario, he's hit well recently, and he's hitting near the top of the order. He's only 3,800 on DraftKings. He's picking up less than 10% ownership. And then somebody else that I think makes sense as a value play, if you're looking to pay up for some of the more expensive pitchers, Owen Miller's been in the lineup recently. He's the flat min price. So there are guys in this lineup who are lower owned. And then there are some of the guys, like you mentioned, Cesar Hernandez, that are going really over owned. Eddie Rosario, nearly 30% ownership. But there are lower owned bats in this lineup that I do think make sense.
Yeah, no, it's reasonable. And again, it's really the top three picking up that lofty ownership. I guess to me, the main thing is stacking up Cleveland. I guess if we're talking about stacking, if you're going to stack up Cleveland, I don't see how you wouldn't get Jose Ramirez and to a lesser extent, Eddie Rosario at 3,400 in the price tag. So that to me is what makes them sort of unappealing. But I think I get what you're saying. I think taking some of these guys as one-offs is fine. But being with any of these guys, being with a 25% Cesar Hernandez, I think is just on its face a bad play.
Yeah. So the initial build I have, let's see, 5% Cesar Hernandez. So he's in the player pool, but it's a fourth of what the field has. So certainly somebody who I would prefer to not have a good game if the ownership stands.
On the other side, we have Sam Hentges, a lefty going against Detroit. He's got a 4.5 implied run total. And this is a spot where the Detroit stack is also going to be very highly owned today. I'm also going to have a decent possibility to be a top stack. And this is really a slate today, guys, where you are going to find a lot of teams that normally we're not talking about as teams that you're really going to for hitting in a meaningful way that are going to be the top stack. So prepare for this one to go in. But Detroit, an 11% chance of being a top stack today, a 14.3% chance of being a top value. The ownership, though, Greg, 14% arrogant ownership expected for Detroit. And I guess, well, the first part we could talk about, Sam Hentges, are you willing to go to him at all? Because at his price tag and the fact that he's been so bad, and I talk about this sometimes with pitchers where, when a guy's been so bad at the numbers and you go to Sam Hentges, a 2.1 whip for himself, a 5.6 xFIP, giving up a 343 batting average, like these are all egregiously bad numbers that you have to think he's going to be better at some point just to kind of get to what a league average pitcher is. And I think that's something I would point out here, but the price tag and the projection, I feel like he's the most live direct pivot to Austin Gomber, besides the fact that he's just been a much worse pitcher than Gomber so far this year.
Yeah, and then so here's what's tough. I mean, just based on ownership, sure, I think it would make some sense to get to Hentges just to be away from some of the more popular pitchers. I mean, we only have him projected for 1% ownership right now. So yeah, if you're playing 150 lineups, be overweight to the 1% number. I am right now. But if you look at Hentges' numbers this year, they're bad. And even you could even make a case that they should be worse. He's a 6.46 ERA, but he has 7.56 expected ERA. If you look at the Zips projection for the rest of the season, they're projecting him for a 6.13 ERA the rest of the way. So, I mean, this isn't somebody I have a massive amount of optimism in that he's all of a sudden going to turn it around. The other thing also, he's basically a long reliever, and he isn't pitching deep into games. He's only 24 years old. They've been, fairly cautious with him, but he's also a non-prospect. Fangraphs doesn't have him ranked overall. He's the 13th ranked prospect in the Indians organization. He does have some decent minor league numbers, so that is the one positive I would say for him, and that nobody's rostering him. So is he better than 1% chance to be optimal? Yeah, probably. But I can't really advocate somebody who's only playing a handful of lineups actually go out and roster Hentges just based on how bad his numbers are this year, and also what the projections are making him look out to be for the rest of the season.
Yeah, no, I think it's a reasonable way to look at it. The swinging strike rate and chase rate, two numbers that we talk about that you build up a little bit of a larger sample size, even while not getting the most batters faced. It's only an 8% or 8.2% swinging strike rate, only a 29% chase rate. Both numbers pretty bad. His average exit velocity also really bad, the 91.4. So really not a lot to point to, though. He does throw a pretty fast fastball, 95 miles per hour. So I think there's some reason to have hope here. To me, if you're playing a 150 max, maybe getting to 10% and shaving that off of Gomber would be a move I wouldn't hate. And for a 20 max too, I could talk myself into 1 or 2 lineups for Hentges, but I'm not the highest talent level so far that we've seen. And hopefully the minors numbers, as Greg is talking about, will improve a little bit more. But everything here looks bad for Hentges. And that is a reason why Detroit is going to be very highly projected owned today as well. They only have a 0.082 ISO against left-hand pitching so far this year. Also a 32% carry. That's been really bad. But these guys, when you look through the numbers overall since 2019, like you do have Jonathan Scope, the 230 ISO. You have Cabrera with the 200 ISO. Eric Haas has had a 280 ISO. Most of his numbers have come this year, but still Nico Goodrum has hit lefties better. Jake Rogers hit lefties pretty well. This has been a spot all year long where it just feels like they should be a little better against left-hand pitching than they have been, Greg. And I feel like this is a spot where I can see this being how they get there. To me, it's a really volatile spot, which is why I don't mind playing Hentges and I don't mind playing some Detroit. But how are you handling the Detroit hitters with a lot of ownership going to some of these guys, particular Jonathan Scope on DraftKings?
Yeah, it says a lot about this slate when the Tigers for the year have a 64 WRC plus against left-handed pitching, and they're facing left-handed pitching, and they're the chalk of the slate. The two most popular offenses we have right now, number 1, Baltimore, and number 2, the Detroit Tigers. So, I mean, just some of these numbers on them, for sure, this is about as good of a spot as they're going to have, and I can't imagine they're going to be this bad going forward. If you told me, are they going to have it above or below a 64 WRC plus against left-handed pitching for the season, I would certainly take the over on that number. There's not much room for it to go down. Then you look at some of the individual ownerships on these guys. We have Jonathan Scope project for nearly 30% ownership. That is way more than I want to roster Jonathan Scope, especially because he's been hitting a little bit more down in the lineup as of late. He was hitting towards the top of the lineup, but we've seen him hit 6th a couple of games ago, and that's a little bit of a difference from when he was hitting 2nd. Maybe they changed that and move him back, but that's really just the issue here is that I don't think I don't have an issue stacking the Tigers. I don't have an issue playing a little bit of Hentges if you're playing, mass entry, but I can't get to the field on Detroit just looking at some of these numbers. Even Miguel Cabrera, he's been terrible this year. He's old, and you've mentioned he is a better hitter over the last few years against left-handed pitching than right-handed pitching, but the ownership's there. It's picking up 16% ownership, and that's kind of across the board. Anybody who has a pulse on offense is 12+% owned.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And it's also a pretty good Cleveland bullpen behind Hentges, too. Only a 1.2 whip allowed this year, 194 batting average, 28% K rate for the bullpen. Also, not a lot of home runs, 2.6% on run rate. So I have some concern here. Detroit could be trappy if you want to get, some guys here, though, coming under on some of the scope ownership, coming under on some of these guys. I think that's a reasonable move. But to me, Detroit, not a team to put all your eggs in the basket of today, no matter what Hench's numbers are on the year. I think there's just a lot more risk here for both sides involved. And like, Greg pointed out, I think you saying it out loud, I think is really something that maybe people need to hear, that it is crazy that so much of the field's going to be playing a team that has a .082 ISO and hits 36% less, or under league average in terms of creating runs and has that strikeout rate. Like, this is really a spot that normally on a bigger slate you might avoid, and it is honestly a big enough slate where it just feels like Detroit should not be treated quite like the field's treating them right now. Let's go to the next game here. We got San Diego, 3.4 implied runs against Brandon Woodruff, an actual good pitcher, 30.5% K rate on the year, 0.74 whip, 3 xFIP. All these numbers basically aligned with where they've been historically. His swing strike rate's been up a little bit since 2019, chase rate down a little bit since 2019, but I think that all comes out in the wash. And Woodruff on a slate where we were talking about playing guys like Gomber, guys like Sam Hentges, guys like really anybody else we're going to talk about coming up here. Brandon Woodruff is a true ace, and I feel like a true stud on the slate, Greg. And I feel like to me, that's really worth a lot of capital. Even going against San Diego, who is a tough team, only has 20% strikeout rate on the year against righties. I feel like playing more Woodruff in the field just seems like a move I'd try to make.
Yeah, so there's three legitimately good starting pitchers on the slate: Brandon Woodruff, Lance Lynn, and Blake Snell. And everybody else, I mean, depending what you want to make of John Means, I think he's heading for some regression after he struggled a little bit recently. But the three guys that I think are legitimate, I'm confident top of the rotation guys, it's Woodruff, Lance Lynn, and Blake Snell. And Woodruff, I think, should be way higher owned on the slate. I understand he's over 30% rostered right now, but I mean, his numbers for the year, 1.58 ERA, 2.5 expected ERA, striking out over 30% of the hitters he's faced for the second consecutive season, 30.5% strikeout rate this year. The walk rate is in check. So, I mean, to me, Woodruff is a pretty high priority play. The only one concern I have here, it's a really difficult matchup. The Padres are a really good offense. Fernando Tatis, he's been crushing lately, and he's finally healthy after he was dealing with some shoulder injuries earlier in the year. If you look at the MVP odds now at sportsbooks, Tatis is now kind of in line with Acuna. Those are the two favorites to win the NL MVP. So Tatis is back. He's hitting well. It's a dangerous offense, but I still lean towards the Woodruff side just because he's so much better than most of the pitching options today.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it is tough, and I think your points are really sound. Tatis's numbers over the last season and change, up to a 335 ISO overall, 164 WRC plus, 8% on run rate. Like, it is scary going against these guys. Woodruff's stuff has been good enough that I think on this slate, I'm willing to at least get to the field. And I think to me, getting a little bit above it, he's projected for just shy of 35% ownership on DraftKings right now. So let that be your guidepost, and we'll see if that changes on the deeper dive coming up in a few hours. San Diego hitters, though, Greg, I guess because of the fact Woodruff will be owned, and as you mentioned, they are a good team, not a great implied total for them with 3.4 runs, but the stack does look a little bit underowned according to the top stacks tool, not the highest probability. Some of the teams that we've talked about already, including the ones in that last game, going to have a higher probability of being a top stack, but getting leverage on the field, taking a team that actually does hit pretty well, Greg. I feel like the Padres stack, not a lot of ownership. I think they are worth some exposure, even though I do have a lot of concern going against Woodruff for the reasons we talked about, that he is legitimately a very good pitcher.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a 6-game slate, right? So you could talk yourself into, hey, I play 150 lineups. I'm going to have a little bit of exposure everywhere, but the Padres still not a high priority team. It looks like the ownership, as you said, is a little bit too low, just given the difficulty of the matchup they're facing. But we still only have them with a 5.8% chance of being the top scoring team on the slate. Not only is Woodruff good, but the Brewers have a really good bullpen behind him. So it's hard for me to imagine that the odds of success are really all that great for the Padres. Is also something that is shown in the top stacks tool, where they are. Let's see, how many teams have a lower? There's only 4 teams with a lower percentage chance of being the top stack of the day. And we also have a handful of teams with double-digit odds of being a top stack. So getting a little bit of exposure to the Padres, especially maybe as a hedge, if you have a lot of exposure to Woodruff, that's reasonable. But it's a low-priority team. Once again, if you're playing single entry, 3 entry, max, I wouldn't be touching the Padres in that sort of situation.
Yeah, I agree. I think that to me, they are a team. If you're putting in a bunch of lineups, you could sort of get there in the hopes that they do get to Woodruff, but it is sort of an unlikely outcome. Blake Snell on the other side, a cheaper price pitcher, has had some good success recently as chalk. So people probably going to be very willing to go there. Field projected to be there about 40% today on DraftKings. And he's got a matchup for himself going against a Milwaukee team with a 27% strikeout on the year, getting a little bit healthier with guys like Christian Yelich back in the mix. Obviously, El Garcia, Lorenzo Cain, all these guys have started to get more meaningful at bats over the last few weeks. Travis Shaw being in the mix, I think, going to also knock it down a little bit more, but still, you have teams who can hit lefties pretty well, but I think not enough to scare me off of going to Blake Snell, Greg. I feel like the spot for him, nice price tag. I think the ownership being lofty is really the main thing. He does project for about 14% more ownership than his chances of being a top pitcher, but still, to me, getting in the neighborhood of 25 to 33%, I think you could even go to the 40% the field's going to be at. I don't really have any gripes with it just because of the fact that Snell's a 33% K rate guy in the year, had some issues with walks and hits, that 1.46 whip for himself, but Snell's been good. And I feel like on the slate again, just gravitating towards a good pitcher is something I'd rather do than going to some of the other guys.
Yeah, so I think the only thing I'd say here is that as of now, I don't have as much interest in Blake Snell as the field does. He's picking up over 40% ownership right now. We have him for 40.2% ownership on DraftKings. It is a favorable price point. It is a favorable matchup against the Brewers. But with that in mind, one thing that's a little bit of a concern with Blake Snell's upside is just his pitch count. He hasn't thrown 100 pitches this entire season. He went 6 innings last start. That was the first time all season he's gone 6 innings, and it's for a couple of reasons. Number one, they've been cautious with his pitch count. And then number two, he's been so inefficient this year. He's generating a lot of strikeouts, but he's also walking a lot of guys. So we've seen starts where he's actually pitched reasonably well, but he's come out after 4 innings. We've seen him exit games with the lead and not get the win because he doesn't complete the 5 innings needed to get the win bonus. So that's something that's a little bit of concern, something that's capped his upside. Just looking through his box scores this year, he's only scored over 20 fantasy points once since opening day. It was his last start. There was also a matchup against the Rockies at home, which was really favorable, but the upside generally hasn't really been there for Blake Snell this year just because of his inability to work deep into games. So getting to him is certainly fine, but I think that 40% ownership on him is a little bit rich by the field.
He's not getting guys to chase as well this year, a 29% chase rate compared to 35% since 2019. And a swinging strike rate's been down to just shy of 13% from 16%. And as Greg's talking about here, and I think we've seen it sometimes with some of these strikeout guys, the Garrett Cole game against Texas is one that stuck out to me a little bit more, where if you're not really mowing through a lineup, you can sort of draw it out long enough that your upside's capped. And I think that could be something here. I would have a little less concern going against Milwaukee, but I agree. Like, I think there are some reasons to have, just him not pitching the most efficiently can be a problem for a guy when he's this chalky. So I think some reasons to not go crazy on Blake Snell. I still wouldn't mind getting closer to the field's 40%, but I do think, to me, coming in a little bit under makes some sense, where if you got to 30%, I think you're getting a little more room to try to find some guys with comparable upside. Milwaukee hitters, though, Greg, I feel like going to them, not something I would want to do very much. Like, I think we made sort of a case for San Diego just because they do have a quality hitting team. And Milwaukee is going to get better, I think, having more of their usual hitters back in the lineup for the most part. But I do think Milwaukee, not a team jumping out to me meaningfully. Yelich is going to be decently owned. I guess they have a 5% chance of being a top stack, but I think it's a good bullpen behind Snell, and Snell himself has been good enough that he might not be efficient enough to be, I think, in a winning lineup, but I still think he's going to inhibit Milwaukee enough that I don't want to get there very much, if at all.
Yeah, and the ownership's there. It's about fair ownership. We have them with 4% projected ownership as a team, so you consider that when Blake Snell's out, like you said, even if it's just 4 innings out of Blake Snell, it's probably going to be 4 pretty decent innings. I don't actually expect him to only go 4, but I don't really expect him to go much deeper than 5 either. So I think that there's a pretty good chance that the Brewers struggle to put runs up in 4 or 5 innings against Snell, and then they're probably going to struggle to score against the bullpen also. So Brewers, another team that I don't really have much interest in. I think that we could not totally leave them out of the player pool on a 6-game slate, but if you're making a bunch of lineups like me, it's only a handful of stacks going to the Brewers.
We're also at about the halfway point of the show now. And here's something that we would appreciate from you guys right now, is hit that like button. There was one dislike on this video before we even started the show. And I know, hey, maybe people don't love Greg in particular. Me, I'm sure they have no issues with, of course, but maybe they don't like one of us and they hit that dislike button. But I think you got to give people a chance here. Give them a shot at doing the show. They have to do it Monday in the morning, waking up at 6 in the morning on the West Coast to do. So I think it'd be great if you guys hit that like button right now. And whenever you miss an Awesemo show, maybe when you don't want to see random dislikes that hurt the host and the analyst finalists of the shows that you're watching so dearly. You can also go to the Awesemo Podcast Network at awesemo.com/podcast. All these shows that have a longer shelf life, like the MLB Strategy Show, like the NBA Strategy Show, those are all in the podcast form. Stuff like the Live Before Lock shows, not so much. But these shows that come out in the morning, you can get them in audio form, listen to them whenever you want throughout the day. Maybe you don't have time to stare at a YouTube screen, or you're just not willing to pay for YouTube Premium and you want to close your phone. I think that's a reasonable take as well. But go to awesemo.com/podcast. Check out all of our podcasts for all the sports, and make sure to give them 5 stars and a review an Apple Podcast as well with your Twitter username or your email address, because you'll be entered to win a free week of Awesemo Plus when you do that. Our way of giving back to you guys for helping grow the podcast. So go right now to awesemo.com/podcast. Check them all out. And also, if you want to add some betting to your life, make sure to go to OddsShopper.com, OddsShopper.awesemo.com as well. Another way you can get there. But the best thing for OddsShopper, really the best thing for you in betting, is going to be getting live line updates from a bunch of different books that are legal in your area and comparing, shopping around to find the best lines. That's what OddsShopper does for you, in addition to some of the win percentage and ROI percentage tools that are going to be more for NBA right now, but for MLB as well. You can find the best deals for all your bets, whether it be actual game lines, player props, all that stuff. So go to OddsShopper.com or OddsShopper.awesemo.com. Check out all the bets that you can make right now. Let's keep talking through, Greg. We got another game with Baltimore, 4.4 implied runs, and this is another spot where Baltimore projected to be the highest probability to be a top stack today, going against Matt Shoemaker. Shoemaker on the year, 14% K rate for himself, somehow pitching 5 innings per appearance, which seems kind of crazy given the fact he's given up a lot of home runs. Is getting swinging strikes a little better than you would think for a guy that is not getting strikeouts at all. A 10.5% swing strike rate, 33.6% chase rate, but he just has had similar numbers since 2019 and doesn't get those results. So I guess let's talk about Shoemaker before we dig into the Baltimore hitting part that is going to be so highly owned. But Shoemaker, I just feel like he's not quite as bad as he's been, but it's been happening long enough that I don't know that I should have a lot more hope to be better. But he's got a 5.4 xFIP on the year, and you look at the underlying numbers, and it just feels like he shouldn't be quite that bad from with the results that he's getting.
Yeah, I mean, whenever anybody has a 6.08 ERA, you go, they shouldn't be quite that bad, although he does have, like you said, a 5.42 xFIP. He does have a 6.19 expected ERA, so there isn't much to suggest he should be significantly better. I think that there's rarely going to be a chance, maybe like Matt Harvey, who I'd expect to have an over 6 ERA for the rest of the season. But even so, Zips has Shoemaker projected for a 5.54 ERA the rest of the season, so there's not too many encouraging signs. And then actually, I look at the overall ownership for Baltimore, and it seems about appropriate. I mean, we do have them with the most ownership on the slate, but we also have them as the team with the best odds of being a top stack by a couple percentage points. So, I mean, with that in mind, in the initial build that I did, the Orioles are the team that I have the most exposure to.
Yeah, I get why they would be, and I certainly think going against Shoemaker, he's again not been good, giving up a 5.6% on run rate for himself. It does seem like the park maybe will help him out a little bit more, but I guess as it starts to heat up, 75 degrees today in Minnesota. Minnesota is one of those parks that does have ideal conditions when it starts to get warmer. I just feel like for me, Shoemaker, another guy that on a slate where there aren't a lot of pitching options, are going to be completely under-owned. I do think Shoemaker to me looks a little bit under-owned. He has an 8% chance of being a top pitcher today, 19% chance of being the top value pitcher, only 1.5% ownership. So I think buying in on him just being a little bit less worse. I think maybe less walks and hits allowed, a 1.2 whip since 2019 compared to the 1.45 whip he's had this year. I don't think Shoemaker's a good pitcher, but on the slate, I'd be willing to play a little bit. Let's talk about the Baltimore hitters though, Greg, because you mentioned them. They are going to be very highly owned. Guys like Anthony Santander projected for over 30% ownership. You also have Austin Hayes, Cedric Mullins projected over 20%, Trey Mancini over 15%, and Ryan Mountcastle, who got back on the board with the home run this weekend and lived up to his name. That sounds like it's more powerful than he personally has been so far. Also over 10% ownership. There are some ways though to stack up Baltimore and not be with the chalky bats. So you are going to have to play guys like a Stevie Wilkerson, like a Severino, Mikael Franco, I guess, Freddie Galvis. These guys all going to be less owned. But how are you handling Baltimore? It's a lot of ownership to be playing guys like Santander, and he's had pop for sure, as has Trey Mancini, but it's going to be a lot of ownership going to guys that I just don't have the highest confidence level in.
Yeah, I still don't mind getting to Mancini's really expensive, but I mean, in general, it's not like the pitching options are all that expensive on the slate. So 5,500 for Trey Mancini, I'm willing to play that when he is coming in at under 20% ownership. When we look at what the overall odds of this team being a top stack are. And then, yeah, some of those guys more towards the bottom of the order, Ryan Mountcastle, who, yeah, he hit that grand slam yesterday, or 2 days ago, he hit that grand slam. But overall, his hitting numbers and his power numbers have been a little bit better recently. He's coming in 12% ownership. I think he's reasonable to play. Mikael Franco, he is a decent enough track record of being a hitter with some pop that I think for him, if you want to get to another Orioles hitter who isn't picking up all that much ownership, 3.5% projected ownership on Maikel Franco. So it's fine to roster some of the chalky Orioles hitters. I just wouldn't make stacks who roster the 5 most popular Orioles hitters all together. I would mix in 1 or 2 of the guys towards the end of the lineup, like Pedro Severino, who is projected for 2% ownership, Franco in the middle with 3.5% ownership, Freddie Galvis 7.6%. So you mix some of these guys in, and then you have an Orioles stack that has upside and isn't quite the most chalky lineup in the world.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Just really putting in one of those guys that I mentioned, Franco, Galvis, Severino, Wilkerson. That is one way if you are going to full stack Baltimore, you can get different. I just feel like a lot of ownership, though. To me, I would cut the numbers a little bit more here, but watch the ownership on the top stacks. So right now they project to be just a little bit overowned. If they end up looking a lot overowned, then certainly you can make some more decisions there. On the other side, we're going to have John Means going. We've talked a good amount about John Means this year. He's up to a 27.4% K rate, 0.75 whip. The numbers have looked good for him. Today he's facing a Minnesota team that has hit lefties pretty hard on the year, a 187 ISO overall, 110 WRC plus. So they're hitting lefties about 10% or creating runs about 10% better than league average against left-hand pitching. And the spot for Means, I feel like there aren't enough strikeouts here to feel the most confident in going his way, but Means is going to be low owned. I guess the thing for Means, you are paying a very steep price tag here on a slate where you do have some, quality pitching that is going to be in comparably difficult spots, but with better strikeout stuff. I don't mind, again, so this is, I guess, the theme of the slate for me. I don't mind getting a little bit of Means here, but I do feel like capping him at 10%. Like, I don't think you need to get much more than that, Greg, but I know you're not as big a fan of John Means at all. So would you get any of him on the slate?
Yeah, I mean, just because the ownership's so low, and I think he is a much better pitcher, at least than some of the other guys who are chalk on the slate. Like, I still think John Means, 6% ownership, that to me is, a little more favorable than Frankie Montas, say, at 46% ownership. Also, John Means, another no-hitter thrower, one of a couple of them on the slate today, along with Spencer Turnbull. And tying this back to Turnbull and something I mentioned before is I talked about the pitch count for Turnbull and how he by far threw the most pitches he's ever thrown this season in his last outing. And now that could potentially have some negative effects on him going forward. We've seen that a little bit with John Means. So in that game, he threw the no-hitter against the Seattle Mariners, the Mariners who also have been no-hit multiple times this year. He threw 113 pitches. The game after that, he only threw 74 pitches. Last start, he only threw 93 pitches. So we've seen his pitch count down a little bit in the couple of games since the no-hitter. And also we've seen his strikeout number, just 9 strikeouts over the last 2 starts. So I think that some of these games where we see pitchers, work really deep into games to get to these no-hitters, and then they throw, way more pitches than they used to throwing. John Means all of a sudden sees, 20 more pitches than he's seen in any other start for the season. I think that could have some effects on overall fatigue going forward. So it's definitely something that I'm keeping my eye on going forward with John Means. If you look at his projections for the rest of the year, Zips has him only projected for a 4.64 ERA. Maybe that's a little bit too pessimistic, but there's definitely reasons to think that John Means has gotten a little lucky this year. He only has a 188 BABIP for the season. That's certainly going to go up. And he also has a 96.5% strand rate. So this is somebody who's gotten as lucky as possible. There's no way he maintains a 1.7 ERA. Even the 3.14 expected ERA, I think that number is probably more likely to go up than anything going forward. The real big issue I have with John Means is just overall what the price point is for him today and the matchup against the Minnesota Twins. So being overweight to the 6% number, sure, that makes sense, but I'd still much rather pay up for Brandon Woodruff.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that to me is the main thing, is that you're only saving a couple $100 by going to John Means over Woodruff. And Woodruff, we talked about, he's in a tough matchup, but the strikeout stuff has been a little bit better. And Means has been good on the year. Like, I don't want to speak ill of him. I think the 15% swing strike rate, a big improvement from 11.3% going back to 2019. He's also faced 215 batters, which is a pretty good benchmark for the year so far. And that's part of what Greg's talking about, pitching deeper in the games. The thing that worries me more about Means, especially as the weather starts to heat up, he's given up a 47% fly ball rate, 116 mile per hour high peak max exit velocity, as well as a 21.5% launch angle. So when he gets hit hard, he's going to get hit really hard. And you're going against Minnesota team who just hits for power across the board, that does get those launch angles in play, that does everything working for him. I think that's where you start to see Means have a little bit less upside. But I think in terms of strikeouts, like, he's going to be a volatile pitcher all year long. You're going to get days where you get him right. I don't mind playing him a little bit because of those days where he's going to be single digit ownership like today. He can't spike a strikeout upside, but I think you just have to be prepared for the fact that he's going to have days where he's probably going to strike out a lot of dudes, and he's going to have days where he gives up 3 3 or 4 home runs and you're probably screwed. And I think that's going to be something to keep in mind, especially when he's playing at his home park. And given that, Greg, the Minnesota hitters to me look overowned by a little bit, but still I get the logic there. It's going to be lofty ownership for guys like Nelson Cruz, who has raked against left-hand pitching since 2019 with a 400 ISO. Mitch Garver, same thing as well. These guys both over 20% ownership. You also have Josh Donaldson in the neighborhood of 20%. Like, I would like to play Minnesota. I would like them more, though, if they were not owned as though they're a sure thing to get to John Means. And I think it's more of a 50-50 probability here of Means getting strikeouts and having a decent day, or just these guys raking him. And I feel like either way, it's just too much ownership of Minnesota given that uncertainty.
Yeah. So, I mean, the other thing here to consider with Minnesota and Means is, even if I said I think Means should regress going forward, keep in mind that's relative to his 1.7 ERA so far this year, and he threw a no-hitter 3 starts ago. So, I mean, if you look at his numbers for the year, there's really only one place for them to go but it has to be backwards. It's not like he's improving on that 1.7 ERA. But with that in mind, Minnesota is a really popular stack for today, and I don't think that that's warranted. I slightly prefer the Means side of the game when you just consider that he's overall still somebody relative to the other pitching options on the slate. I think at worst, he's the 4th best starting pitcher. I would comfortably say for me that Woodruff, Lynn, and Blake Snell are all better than John Means. But then you look at some of the other guys who are picking up ownership on the slate. You know, I definitely think Means is better than Frankie Montas. I think he's better than Yusei Kikuchi. I think he's better than Austin Gomber. So I think that there's much better pitchers to target and stack against today than John Means.
So I guess in terms of your ownership exposures to these guys, like relative to the field being 25% on Cruz, being over 20% on Garver, are you going to be like, are you envisioning yourself being around 10% for these guys? Are you envisioning coming under much less? Like, how are you approaching the stack? Because I guess you could also still play guys like Cruz and Garver if you wanted, and then decrease the ownership product with guys like Rob Refsnyder, who's not a bad hitter. Kepler certainly has enough pop to get there. Like, there's a lot of ways to handle Minnesota, even if you don't have the highest faith in Means. So I'm just curious what your numbers look like for how you're approaching the Minnesota Twins stack.
Yeah, so I think one thing that is going to be interesting for me is what does the ownership actually end up being to some of these end-of-the-order bats like Alex Krylov or Max Kepler, because these guys are projecting for really low ownership right now. So if you want to take these guys as one-offs, we have no ownership going to Krylov right now. We have 0.7% ownership going to Kepler. One of the issues I have with Nelson Cruz, even though it's he crushes left-handed pitching and he's somebody who just seems to get better as he gets older, and I'm sure Tyler, just any mention of Nelson Cruz, I'm sure that Tyler, I actually make a point to bring up Nelson Cruz whenever the Twins are on the slate just to get reactions out of Tyler, because I know that he's not his favorite player in the world, but it's the 25% ownership also paired with a 6,100 price tag. That is a lot to pay for Nelson Cruz. And while he's always live to hit a home run against left-handed pitching, you basically need him to hit a home run at that kind of price point. So to me, the 24% numbers at least want to come underweight to the field on.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable way to look at it too. And decent implied total here, going to be high ownership. And again, tune into the deeper dive. We'll give you guys a better read on the ownership coming up today. And Tyler, of course, has sent a snarky chat in our Zoom session. He's not live to catch a fly ball. Actually, Tyler said vatch a fly ball. I presume he means catch. But that's, look, he's not a great fielder, but that's what's going to happen when you're 55 years old and just mainlining PEDs every single morning to stay alive.
Yeah, I mean, and we're going to talk about Frankie Montas in a second too, but I think something that's really impressive about the run that Nelson Cruz has been on is you figure when somebody's in their late 30s and they test positive for PEDs, be like, look, he is a guy, his power upside has spiked a lot in the later part of his career. He popped positive. You have to expect the power numbers to go down. Not the case. They've gone up. Unlike Frankie Montas, we're going to talk about in a little bit, who tested positive for PEDs and just kind of sucks now. Yeah,
so kudos to Nelson Cruz figuring out the best PEDs out there. That's really the main thing you should do. I would consider Nelson Cruz to be the Yelp.com of PED ratings, and I would take any advice that he has to offer right now. Somebody trying to get in a better summer shape. Yeah, the next game up though, we got St. Louis 3.6 implied runs against Lance Lynn. Lance Lynn, a guy not quite priced like one of the studs, and not quite getting the results of some of the studs on the slate with a 27.7% K rate, which is right in line with his 2019 sample size. 27.5% K rate for himself, avoiding home runs pretty well, a low whip under one with a 0.98 whip for himself. And Lance Lynn, I think, looks fine on the slate. A guy that looks to me a little bit overowned, but still not overowned enough where I'd have any fear getting him. Lance Lynn, 33% projected ownership. Greg, I feel like he's a solid play on a day where there are some guys who have a little more upside, a couple guys who maybe are in tougher spots. And I feel like the net result for Lance Lynn is he might be one of the safer plays on the slate just in terms of getting you an expected outcome close to his median projection.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, the way that Lance Lynn provides upside that maybe was a little bit under the radar is just pitch count. The last two outings, he's thrown 108 and 111 pitches. He's somebody who's really stayed healthy for the most part of his career over the last few years, and he works really deep into games. So you consider him and compare him to somebody like Blake Snell, and you go, well, I'm going to get 20 more pitches out of Lance Lynn. I'm going to get out of Blake Snell. And then you think like, all right, so maybe a couple less strikeouts, but that's definitely offset by the fact that he's going to be working deeper into the game. So to me, that's one of the main appeals to Blake Snell. I think it's a little bit lost in the shuffle is that he works really deep into games and he's allowed to throw over 100 pitches fairly regularly, which is really uncommon in baseball today.
Yeah, no, I think that's a reasonable way to look at it. And that to me is why Lance Lynn, I think, arguably safer than any play on the slate in terms of just getting that run. Like there's no concerns like Greg was talking about earlier with Blake Snell, where maybe he just doesn't get deep enough. Like Lance Lynn's going to give you over 5 innings of probably competent ball, and that could be enough to really justify the exposure going his way. St. Louis hitters, though, do project to have a higher probability to be a top stack in their ownership. And I'm not, as I've gone on the limb with many times in the show, I'm not the biggest fan of the Cardinals hitters, though they are getting a pretty good park upgrade going to the White Sox park in a day where it should be just shy of 80 degrees in Chicago. But St. Louis, to me, like you can get there. I don't really see any reason to love it going against Lance Lynn. A mediocre bullpen, I guess, to a decent bullpen with a 3.7 xFIP behind Lance Lynn as well. St. Louis, you can get there, but Greg, I just don't see him being a priority, though the top stack still, I think, does sort of say, like, you should play a little bit of these guys.
Yeah, so one thing about going up against Lance Lynn is he's somebody who for his career has always shut down right-handed pitchers, but struggles a little bit more against lefties. First career, he allows a 331 WOBA to lefties. He's been a little better against them in recent years, but still, that's been one thing that's been a weakness throughout his career is that when he does get hit, it's by left-handed bats. And one thing that makes an issue in terms of that, when you look at the matchup against the Cardinals, their best hitters are all right-handed bats. So it's kind of hard for me to see where the upside is going to be with the Cardinals when, Nolan Arenado, he's in the MVP mix right now, but a right-handed hitter, Paul Goldschmidt, right-handed hitter. So I'm not sure who the guys are on St. Louis that I'd really feel comfortable about getting to. Maybe, Tommy Edman, just because he's a switch hitter and he's cheap-ish at, well, not really, actually, 4,600. I was getting his price confused with Harrison Bader. I saw right below him at 3,100. So, yeah, I don't know if there's any one hitter that really stands out just because so many of the top hitters for the Cardinals, Yadier Molina, Nolan Arenado, Paul Goldschmidt, are all righties, and it's so hard to produce as a right-handed bat against Lance Lynn.
The rudeness of not throwing Matt Carpenter in the mix, even though he's clearly the best days are behind him as well. But he's still a lefty who has some pop. I think probably the most pop out of the lefties in the order. And it's worth pointing out, though, like I think your point about Lance Lynn's pretty sound. He does strike out lefties less than league average compared to a 32.5% K rate against righties since 2019. But he gives up not a lot of power against lefties, only a 1.7% home run rate compared to a 3.8% to righties. So, like, I think even though maybe a lefty can get to him, I don't think it's enough to justify it. I don't know. Like I just don't like St. Louis ever, but I do think in the spot, like you kind of just have to take whatever you can get here. And maybe these guys aren't going to look the best. And I wouldn't worry about the split as much as just like, hey, if you get some of Arenado and Goldschmidt and these guys, Arenado at 5,400, that was so egregious, but getting some of these guys doesn't seem the worst thing in the world. I just don't have a strong preference to who you're going to get. Because like paying that much for Tommy Edman, like I don't like that really. Cardinals are just one of those teams. DFS, I feel like, does not do them any favors for my fandom. On the other side, we have Kwang Hyun Kim going against the White Sox. Kim has been hit pretty okay, I guess, on the year, or a 250 batting average for himself, but a 3.8 xFIP seems like he's been a little better than I guess the results have been for him so far. Not getting strikeouts that much, 23.7% K rate, basically in line with the league average so far this year. Home run rate for himself under 1% has not been the highest, and he's also been pitching real slow, under 90 miles per hour on his fastball is not the best for him. Same thing going back to last season as well. Kim, to me, as a pitcher, I know we talked a lot today about crappy pitching, but I feel like even amidst the crappy pitching, I don't see a reason to play much Kwang Hyun Kim, if any, today.
So one thing I'm curious about here, though, is we haven't projected for no ownership right now. We haven't projected for 0.1% ownership. I assume that's going to get updated at some point during the day. But if this is actually going to hold true, where he has no ownership, just given how bad the pitching options are, like, is Kwang Hyun Kim like that much worse than Austin Gomber when Gomber's picking up like 60x the ownership right now? I don't think that's the case. So if he's actually going to be unowned, then I think it makes some sense to get to Kim. He's certainly been lucky this year. As a 2.73 ERA, a 4.56 expected ERA. Like you said, the average fastball velocity below 90 miles per hour. But to me, just looking at him right now, he's cheap, and it would just be an ownership play if he's actually going to pick up less than 1% ownership.
Yeah, I get it, I guess, with the ownership play. I just going against the White Sox in a day where the weather's starting to look better and they hit lefties really well in the year. It just gives me enough concern for Kim. But I guess from an ownership perspective, if you want to play some Kim or if Greg plays some Kim, I certainly wouldn't be mad at it. I just think the numbers to me, nothing standing out meaningfully and maybe enough to impress these White Sox hitters. And they are going to be owned about as high as anybody on the slate today, Greg. You have a lot of ownership going to guys like Tim Anderson, Jose Abreu, Yasmani Grandal, also projected for a good amount as well. But even the guys who are less owned like Madrigal, Moncada, Yerman Mercedes also projected for over 10% ownership, closer to 15 for some of them. And I like the White Sox in this spot. I think they're in a decent situation. They have a 195 ISO on the year against left-hand pitching, getting on base at 362 clip, a 135 WRC plus, so hitting about 35% better than league average against left-hand pitching. I like the White Sox, but the ownership here, like everybody's going to be there. I do have to say relative to chalk stacks, though, like I would feel a little more comfortable being with a chalky White Sox team than like a chalky Baltimore team for myself, Greg. But how are you grading out the White Sox for you?
Yeah, I'd rather get to Baltimore personally. I said before, they are the team who in the initial build I did for today, they are the offense I have the most exposure to. And I think the biggest issue I have with the White Sox here is beyond just the ownership. They're so expensive. Tim Anderson, 22% projected ownership. He's 5,900. Jose Abreu, over 20% projected ownership. He's 5,100. Then we've got Yasmani Grandal, catcher. He's reasonably priced, but he's picking up 24% ownership. We've got Yerman Mercedes. He's fairly popular at 4,900. So the price tags here are really exorbitant, and I think that's something that's going to prevent me from getting to them, too much differently in the field. I definitely think they're somewhat of a high priority stack relative to other teams, but I mean, I'd rather stack the Orioles for sure.
Okay. Yeah, I think I get where you're going with it. I would be willing to pay the price tags here in the hope that maybe the ownership comes in a little lower. I also think, if you want to pay up a little bit more to get to Yerman Mercedes over Yasmani Grandal, it's one way to get about half the ownership at that position. Because Grandal, as we talked about here, are projected for over 24% ownership compared to just 12% for Mercedes. So some ways to stack up the White Sox here, and I think get different, but I get why people might want to go elsewhere, and it is going to be a little bit easier to afford some of the other teams that we've touched on. One more game to get to here. Seattle getting 3.2 implied runs against the aforementioned chalk of Frankie Montas. Montas on the year down to a 21.4% K rate. He's faced 210 batters as well, so sample size getting big enough. His swing strike rate and his chase rate have been pretty much aligned where they've been historically, so maybe you could see an uptick back to closer to the 24.7% K rate, but sort of hard to account for that given the fact that he's now not getting those good PEDs, I guess, or at least we're assuming so. And going back to 2019 was getting some of those to get a little bit more in the way of strikeouts. Velocity, though, has been flat, 96.3 miles per hour since 2019, 96.3 miles per hour this year. And I guess that's sort of the way you can credit Frankie Montas here, Greg. He's facing a Seattle team. It's been no hit enough times on the year to know that they are occasionally going to be worth targeting in that way. 6 guys that strike out above league average in the projected lineup. Like, I get why people are going to Montas, but it is going to be tough to be left holding the bag if a chalk Frankie Montas gets hit hard.
Yeah, and so this is really the big leverage play on the slate for me is I'm going to be fairly heavy on the Seattle Mariners offense. I'm going to be fairly light on Frankie Montas, just considering what the ownership is right now. We have Montas projected for 44% ownership, and then we have the Mariners as a stack only projecting for 2.6% ownership. So I look at all those numbers, and to me, the top way to differentiate on the slate, go out, stack the Mariners, and this is going to be the spot that makes or breaks me tonight. And it doesn't feel great stacking the Mariners, but I don't know how anybody can feel great pitching Frankie Montas either, given what his results have been as of late. So Frankie Montas this year, 4.79 ERA, a 4.49 expected ERA. Last year, 5.6 ERA, a 4.58 expected ERA. So the Seattle Mariners offense against right-handed pitching this year, it's not been great. As we mentioned, they have been no-hit a couple of times. They've been 86 WRC plus against righties. But I mean, I just have to play the ownership game here and look at some of these numbers and see that Frankie Montas wildly over-owned and the Mariners going fairly low-owned.
Yeah, I still don't mind getting some exposure to Montas. He does have a 27.4% chance of being a top pitcher today on DraftKings combined with 46% ownership. So it does look over-owned, but you throw in the fact that he has a 42.6% chance of being one of the top value pitchers. And I think for me in particular, liking the White Sox and the pay-up options for the most part at the bats, like I can see getting to Montas, it's some number that's not quite with the field, but going to be significant for exposure. But I get what Greg is saying here, going to Seattle, getting leverage against a pitcher who has been hit pretty hard this year, 12% barreled ball rate, launch angle also been pretty favorable as well. It is a cold day, under 60 degrees in Oakland, so that's something to keep in mind here, that the park is really going to favor pitching, but Seattle's certainly going to be a team I think that you can justify getting some of. Which bats are standing out to you the most in Seattle? And I guess relative to the numbers, Greg, because you don't have to get a lot of ownership for Seattle to get above the field. Only 2.6% aggregate ownership expected for him. How much Seattle do you see yourself getting today? Like, are you getting to 10%? Are you getting to 15%? What's the number that you're feeling? Obviously, not knowing your full exposure is going to be there later in the day.
Yeah, so in the initial build I did, I had 12% exposure of Seattle as a stack, which, I mean, relative to the field, that's 6x the field. And that was a number that I was pretty happy with. And I assume as long as Frankie Montas remains chalk, the Mariners are going to be a team I get double-digit exposure to as a stack today. Definitely one of my favorite teams to look at from a leverage standpoint. And then some of the individual hitters I'm getting to a lot. I'm way overweight to the field on Mitch Haniger, way overweight on Kyle Seager. Kyle Lewis, he's back in the lineup now. He's only 3,300. He was great last year. He's somebody who I want to be overweight to the field on. Now, Kelenic, one of the top hitting prospects in baseball, he has really struggled as of late, but still he's cheap. He hits near the top of the order. He's somebody I like a lot. So there's really not a single hitter that has a pulse in the Mariners lineup that I'm not going to be overweight to the field on.
Yeah, I think Kyle Lewis, a cheap price tag as well, does great out to me to be one of the better hitters in the lineup, and a lineup that really just has nobody who's going to be, I think, qualifying as a great hitter. But I get it. Like, I think taking some Seattle, and I think 12% to me, that seems like a reasonable number. I think anything to me under 15%, I think you're going to be safe enough and not exposing yourself in a really dangerous way, obviously, for baseball, and you're getting that contrarian leverage against Montas. So playing some Seattle despite the low implied total does make sense. The other side, we have Yusei Kikuchi, who is not going to be chalked today after a few runs recently where he has been that guy, but still has a 26.4% carried on the year, only a 1.1 whip. Even though people might have had some bad experiences with him lately, like going against Oakland, not the ideal matchup for Kikuchi, but because of the park playing a little bit colder today and generally going to help out the pitchers, I don't hate the idea of Kikuchi. He's only 14% owned. The projection doesn't look fantastic. Like, I think you can get to Kikuchi today a little bit at his price tag. He's not a deep discount like he has been previously, Greg, but give me your thoughts on Kikuchi. Would you get there at all?
Yeah, I'm overweight to the field on him right now. His K percentage has gone up in each of his 3 years in the big leagues. He went from 16.1% K rate in his first season, 24.2%, now to 26.4%. We've also seen upticks in his velocity, which something that I always think is important to talk about when we talk about Kikuchi is that his first year in the big leagues, coming over from Japan, 92.6 average fastball velocity. This year he's up to 95.4. So there are material changes we could look at with Kikuchi that would make us expect that he's going to be a better pitcher this year. But it doesn't mean that he's going to be somebody who's lights out right now. Like I said, I mentioned a decent enough strikeout rate, 4.32 ERA, 4.56 expected ERA. He's better than a lot of these mid-tier pitchers on the slate. I also think he's priced about appropriately. The ownership's low enough to where I'm slightly overweight to the field on. Also, our top pitchers tool. I think we had him, we have him 18.4% chance to be a top 2 pitcher on the slate, 14.9% ownership. So I think getting around 20% exposure to Kikuchi, that's reasonable, a little bit overweight to the field, but not somebody I'd be going all in on or anything.
And the Oakland hitters, 4.3 implied runs for them. Kikuchi really not giving up a lot in the way of power this year. I guess a 4.5% home run rate, but the launch angle, the barrel ball rate for himself, not that high. For the most part, has been getting ground balls pretty well, 29% fly ball rate on the year. I don't have a lot of hopes for Oakland hitters today, though they do look underowned the top stack tool, so I could see getting there a little bit, Greg. But I just feel like, to me, Oakland right now, not a team that I'm dying to play. I think when they're playing in park upgrades or playing in a little bit warmer days, like I don't mind getting there to a bit more, but it feels like the field's going to be having them mostly appropriately owned, and I just don't view them. Like, if I didn't get a lot of Oakland today, I don't think I'd be sweating it that much.
No, this isn't a high priority stack for me. There isn't that much ownership going there, but I think there are teams with comparable upside that have even less ownership, especially if we're going to somebody like Seattle on the other side of the game that also presents leverage. If the ownership for Kikuchi became more substantial, then I think you could talk me into Oakland as a leverage team, except I don't think that's going to be the case. I don't think the field is going to be flocking to play Yusei Kikuchi. So with that in mind, I think going about neutral to the field on Oakland, it's a reasonable stance.
All right, so that covers everything. Greg, give people your final plugs. In addition to the fact people should be hitting this like button and subscribing to the channel before they run out here, and we appreciate that a bunch. But I know people should be following you at Ehrenberg Dfs, but what else do you have coming up show-wise or anything else you want to hit on?
Yeah, I'll be doing NBA Live Before Lock with Eric tonight, and who knows what kind of characters and whatnot we'll have to bring out, because there's a lot of time to fill on these 1 or 2 game NBA slates to kill an hour. So Eric and I'll be doing that from 6:30 to 7:30 tonight Eastern time. So check that out if you haven't done it already. Also, please like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel so you know when everything goes live, and then also just make Spags and I feel good about ourselves. We like to be liked.
That is true. We do like to be liked here. Helps us out as well, obviously, not just for our ego's sake, but also for the sake of fighting off the YouTube algorithm and all that. So try to like the videos on here, as well as any other content you like on the channel or elsewhere. It just helps out the overall content creation community. Follow at Ehrenberg Dfs. Follow at Chris Spags. Check me out on the MLB Deeper Dive coming up in 3 hours, 12 p.m. on the West Coast, 3 p.m. on the East Coast. We'll be talking through all the top stacks and top pitchers one more time with all the best information available with me alongside Alex and Terry coming up then. And the tip-off, it'll be Aton today hosting instead of Kayla, alongside myself and Eric. So watch that show right after. We've got lots of content coming up on the channel. We appreciate you guys for being here. Check out everything else coming up today, and we'll see you guys again soon. Good luck.